This aircraft was so influential that its design directly inspired the tail fins of the 1948 and 1949 Cadillac, bringing aviation style to the American highway. Reportedly nicknamed Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil in German, today's video looks into the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, the famous World War II American fighter. Welcome, viewers. I'm your host, Major Tom Simpson. Call sign ground control, and let's get started on the history of the P-38 Lightning. The Lightning story begins in 1937 when the Lockheed Corporation submitted their design for the United States Army Air Corps Circular Proposal X-608. Essentially, X-608 was a magical wish list for the Army, as its specifications for an interceptor were well above any other such plane in service in the U.S. military at the time. It was meant to have a maximum speed of at least 360 miles per hour, when the status quo at that time was about 300 miles per hour. It also had to be able to climb to an altitude of 20,000 feet within 6 minutes, and carry a heavy armament payload of a minimum of 1,000 pounds. One of the X-608 proposal authors, First Lieutenant Ben Kelsey, explained 40 years later that they drew up the specification using the word interceptor as a way to bypass the inflexible Army Air Corps requirement for pursuit aircraft to carry no more than 500 pounds of armament, including ammunition, and to bypass the Army Air Corps' restriction of single-seat aircraft to one engine. The ultimate aim of X-608 was to get a more capable fighter, better at dogfighting and at high-altitude combat. Lockheed won the competition on the 23rd of June 1937 with its Model 22, and was contracted to build a prototype XP-38 for $163,000, though Lockheed's own cost on the prototype would add up to $761,000. Construction began in July 1938 in an old bourbon distillery purchased by Lockheed to house expanding operations. This secure and remote site was later identified by Kelly Johnson, the famous Lockheed aeronautical and systems engineer, as the first of 5 Lockheed Skunk Works locations. The XP-38 first flew on the 27th of January 1939 at the hands of Ben Kelsey. The Lockheed design incorporated tricycle undercarriage and a bubble canopy, and featured 2 1,000-horsepower turbo-supercharged 12-cylinder Allison V1710 engines fitted with counter-rotating propellers to eliminate the effect of engine torque. The turbochargers were positioned behind the engines with the exhaust side of the units exposed along the dorsal surfaces of the booms. Counter-rotation was achieved by the use of handed engines. The crankshafts of the engines turned in opposite directions, a relatively easy task for the V1710 modular design aircraft power plant. The P-38 was the first American fighter to make extensive use of stainless steel and smooth, flush-riveted, butt-jointed aluminum skin panels. It was also the first military airplane to fly faster than 400 miles per hour in level flight. Kelsey then proposed a speed dash to Wright Field on the 11th of February 1939 to relocate the aircraft for further testing. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Corps, approved of the record attempt and recommended a cross-country flight to New York. The flight set a speed record by flying from California to New York in 7 hours and 2 minutes, not counting 2 refueling stops. Kelsey flew conservatively for most of the way, working the engines gently, even throttling back during descent to remove the associated speed advantage. Bundled up against the cold, General Arnold congratulated Kelsey at Wright Field during his final refueling stop and said, "Don't spare the horses," on the next leg. After climbing out of Wright Field and reaching altitude, Kelsey pushed the XP-38 to 420 miles per hour. Nearing his destination, Kelsey was ordered by Mitchell Field Tower in Hempstead, New York, into a slow landing pattern behind other aircraft. Unfortunately, carburetor icing caused it to be brought down short of the Mitchell runway, and it was wrecked. However, based on the success of everything else, the Army Air Corps ordered 13 YP-38s in April 1939. Lockheed's chief test pilot, Tony Levier, angrily characterized the accident as an unnecessary publicity stunt, but according to Kelsey, the loss of the prototype, rather than hampering the program, sped the process by cutting short the initial test series. The success of the aircraft design contributed to Kelsey's promotion to captain in May 1939. The first YP-38 wasn't completed until September 1940, with its maiden flight on the 17th of September. The 13th and final YP-38 was delivered to the Army Air Corps in June 1941. 12 aircraft were retained for flight testing and 1 for destructive stress testing. The YPs were substantially redesigned and differed greatly in detail from the hand-built XP-38. They were lighter and included changes in engine fit. The propeller rotation was reversed, with the blades spinning outward away from the cockpit, rather than inward as before. This improved the aircraft's stability as a gunnery platform. While the P-38 had all the makings of an excellent fighter, Lockheed discovered one of its biggest weaknesses during test flights. During high-speed flight approaching Mach 0.68, especially during dives, the aircraft's tail would begin to shake violently and the nose would tuck under, steepening the dive. Once caught in this dive, the fighter would enter a high-speed compressibility stall, and the controls would lock up, leaving the pilot no option but to bail out, if possible, or remain with the aircraft until it got down to denser air where he might have a chance to pull out. During a test flight in May 1941, Army Air Corps Major Signe Gilkey managed to stay with a YP-38 in a compressibility lockup, riding it out until he recovered gradually using elevator trim. Lockheed engineers were very concerned by this limitation, but first had to concentrate on filling the current order of aircraft. It took 2 more years of extensive testing before Lockheed finally discovered what was causing this dangerous flaw in their fighter. Kelly Johnson said in his autobiography that he pleaded with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics to do model tests in its wind tunnel. They already had experience of models thrashing around violently at speeds approaching those requested, and did not want to risk damaging their tunnel. General Arnold, head of the newly named U.S. Army Air Force, ordered them to run the tests, which were done up to Mach 0.74. The P-38's dive problem was revealed to be the center of pressure, moving back toward the tail when in high-speed flight. The solution was to change the geometry of the wing's lower surface, when diving to keep the lift within bounds on the top of the wing. In February 1943, quick-acting dive flaps were tried and proven by Lockheed test pilots. The dive flaps were installed outboard of the engine nacelles and, in action, they extended downward 35 degrees in 1.5 seconds. The flaps did not act as a speed brake. They affected the pressure distribution in a way that retained the wing's lift, thereby solving the dangerous compressibility stall. Late in 1943, a few hundred dive flap field modification kits were assembled to give North African, European, and Pacific P-38s a chance to withstand compressibility and expand their combat tactics. Unfortunately, the kits did not always reach their destination. In March 1944, 200 dive flap kits intended for the European Theater of Operations P-38Js were destroyed in a mistaken identification incident in which an RAF fighter shot down the Douglas C-54 Skymaster, taking the shipment to England, mistaking it for a German Focke-Wulf FW200. Back in Burbank, P-38Js coming off the assembly line in spring 1944 were towed out to the ramp and modified in the open air. The flaps were finally incorporated into the production line in June 1944 on the last 210 P-38Js. Despite testing having proved the dive flaps effective in improving tactical maneuvers, a 14-month delay in production limited their implementation, with only the final half of all Lightnings built having the dive flaps installed as an assembly line sequence. Before the dive flaps were added to the P-38, the kill ratio in early 1944 was 1:1. After the flaps were installed and used in combat, that ratio jumped to 4:1, transforming the 15th Air Force's P-38 groups from cautious escorts to aggressive hunters. The Lightning struggled in the European theater due to the cold temperatures and stiffer competition from high-performance German aircraft. Combined with the challenges faced by P-38s in combat due to their compressibility stall issues, they were not as successful as the Americans would have liked. However, the move to the warmer climate of the Pacific Theater allowed the P-38 to perform at a much higher level of success against the Japanese. The P-38 is credited with destroying more Japanese aircraft than any other U.S. fighter. While it could not outturn the agile Japanese A6M0 at speeds below 200 miles per hour, it utilized superior speed and climb rates to employ energy tactics making high-speed passes and engaging at long distances with its concentrated nose-mounted firepower. This armament setup was particularly devastating against lightly armored Japanese warplanes. As mentioned, the P-38's service record shows mixed results, which may reflect more on its employment than on flaws with the aircraft. The P-38's engine troubles at high altitudes only occurred with the 8th Air Force. One reason for this was the inadequate cooling systems of the G and H models. The improved P-38J and L had tremendous success flying out of Italy into Germany at all altitudes. Until the J-25 variant, P-38s were easily avoided by German fighters because of the lack of dive flaps to counter compressibility in dives. German fighter pilots not wishing to fight would perform the first half of a split S and continue into steep dives because they knew the Lightnings would be reluctant to follow. On the positive side, having two engines was a built-in insurance policy. Many pilots arrived safely back to base after having an engine failure en route or in combat. On the 3rd of March 1944, the first Allied fighters reached Berlin on a frustrated escort mission. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Jenkins of the 55th Fighter Group led the group of P-38H pilots, arriving with only half his force after flak damage and engine trouble took their toll. On the way into Berlin, Jenkins reported one rough-running engine, causing him to wonder if he would ever make it back. The B-17s he was supposed to escort never showed up, having turned back at Hamburg. Jenkins and his wingman were able to drop tanks and outrun enemy fighters to return home with 3 good engines between them. In the European theater, P-38s made 130,000 sorties with a loss of 1.3% overall. In comparison, the P-51s posted a 1.1% loss. Though appearing later in the war, the Mustang benefited from greater numerical superiority and more mature tactics. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Hubbard, a vocal critic of the aircraft, rated it the 3rd best Allied fighter in Europe. The Lightning's greatest virtues were long range, heavy payload, high speed, fast climb, and concentrated firepower. In the Pacific Theater, the P-38 downed over 1,800 Japanese aircraft, with more than 100 pilots becoming aces by downing 5 or more enemy aircraft. American fuel supplies also contributed to a better engine performance and maintenance record, and range was increased with leaner mixtures. In the second half of 1944, the P-38L pilots out of Dutch New Guinea were flying 950 miles, fighting for 15 minutes and returning to base. Such long legs were invaluable until the P-47N and P-51D entered service. One of the many strengths of the P-38 was that all its guns were located in the nose, unlike in the wings of most conventional fighters. Wing-mounted guns had to be aimed at a fixed convergence point, which limited their effective weapon range, whereas the Lightning had all its guns in the nose and had an effective range of 1,000 yards or more. German and Japanese pilots knew not to face the Lightning in a head-to-head position, as they would inevitably get cut to pieces from a distance, long before they could bring their own guns to bear on the P-38. German ace Franz Steigler described a head-on attack against the P-38 as suicide. As proof of the effectiveness of the P-38 as a fighter, the 2 top-scoring American aces in World War II were both Lightning pilots in the Pacific Theater. Richard Bong scored 40 victories, closely followed by Thomas Maguire with 38. At least 2 well-known books were written that specifically covered the rivalry and kill score competition between Bong and Maguire. Aces High, the heroic saga of the 2. Top-scoring American aces of World War II by Bill Yen focused directly on Bong and Maguire, framing their intertwined combat careers and personal stories as a heroic rivalry for top U.S. ace. The other well-known book was Race of Aces, World War II's elite airmen, and the epic battle to become the master of the sky by John R. Bruning, which covered a broader race among several 5th Air Force fighter pilots, Bong, Maguire, Neil Kirby, Charles McDonald, and Gerald Johnson, to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker's record of 26 aerial victories in World War I and become America's leading ace. One other noted pilot of the P-38 was Robin Olds, the famous American Air Force pilot and commander who became a triple ace across 2 different wars, World War II and the Vietnam War. Olds was the last P-38 ace in the 8th Air Force and the last in the European theater of operations. Flying a P-38J, he downed 5 German fighters on 2 separate missions over France and Germany. He subsequently transitioned to P-51s and scored 7 more kills. After World War II, he flew F-4 Phantom IIs in Vietnam, ending his career as brigadier general with 16 kills. Because of its ability to fly long distances, the Lightning figured in one of the most significant operations in the Pacific Theater, Operation Vengeance, the interception of Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval strategy in the Pacific, including the attack on Pearl Harbor. When American codebreakers found out that he was flying to Bougainville Island to conduct a frontline inspection, 16 P-38G Lightnings were sent in April 1943 on a long-range fighter intercept mission, flying 600 miles from Guadalcanal at heights of 10 to 50 feet above the ocean to avoid detection. The Lightnings met and attacked Yamamoto's 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty fast bomber transports and 6 escorting Zeros just as they arrived at the island. The first Betty crashed in the jungle and the second ditched near the coast. The Americans lost 1 P-38. Japanese search parties found Yamamoto's body at the jungle crash site the next day. Before this mission, Japanese morale was high, with Yamamoto seen as the god of the Navy. After his death, there was shock and silence, with the public not being told about Yamamoto's death until a month later. Morale was crushed, and it was said that he engaged in combat and met a gallant death. Over 1,200 P-38s, that's 1 in 9 of all units made, were built as unarmed photo reconnaissance aircraft, including the very oddly designed Droop Snoot Pathfinder version, which had a real live bombardier seated in the nose. Not the easiest position to get out if you needed to abandon your plane and parachute to safety. Overall, the P-38 Lightning was an enduring icon for multiple reasons. As I previously mentioned, it inspired the tail fin design of the 1948 and 49 Cadillac automobile. Following World War II, the Lightning transitioned from combat to competition, becoming a popular contender in air races from 1946 through 1949, including events held in Reno and Cleveland. The aircraft's involvement in this racing era was characterized by specific modifications and famous pilots. Tony Livier, a Lockheed test pilot, purchased a P-38J model, painted it bright red to make it stand out, and utilized it as an air racer and stunt flyer. An associate of the Confederate Air Force, Lefty Gardner piloted a famous mid-1944 P-38 named White Lightning. To suit the specific demands of pylon racing, this aircraft featured reworked turbo systems and intercoolers for optimum low-altitude performance, and was fitted with P-38F-style air intakes for improved streamlining. The twin-boom fighters were noted for making screaming turns around the pylons at these events. Finally, one other interesting and not well-known piece of popular culture involving the P-38 was that the whine of the speeder bike engines in Return of the Jedi was partly achieved by recording the engine noise of a P-38, combined with that of a North American P-51 Mustang. In total, 10,037 P-38 Lightnings were built, and it was the only American fighter in continuous production from Pearl Harbor through to VJ Day. To this day, it remains an iconic aircraft and part of the history of Lockheed's ingenuity in aircraft design and production. Okay, that's it for today's military aviation history lesson. I hope you found it interesting. Visit the fightson.net website and YouTube channel for more military aviation content. And you can join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/fightson. This is Major Tom Simpson signing off until next time.